Hello and welcome to NC DeBrief. The DeBrief brings you Africa's social stories into focus through analysis and perspectives every week. With our guests, we dissect pressing issues and look out for angles and opinions that may not be in the mainstream. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Today, we're having part 2 of our hot button topic, contraceptive use in Africa. Now, don't forget that you can join the conversation using the hashtag NCDebrief and also share your thoughts with us. Now, if you missed part 1 of this conversation, please head to our YouTube channel and search for News Central TV. So in part 1 of this conversation, we looked at what contraception is, the issues around getting men involved, and some of the hindrances to full acceptance and usage of contraceptives on the continent. Today, we want to pick up that conversation and then get into sex education. All of that comes your way right after this break. This is NC DeBrief. I'm Tolu. Welcome. Thank you so much for staying with us. Let me do a quick introduction of our guests. Now, back from part 1 of this conversation, I have Lolo Cynthia. She is a reproductive and sexual health educator as well as a child rights activist. Lolo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I know what you went through to get here, so we definitely appreciate it. And also joining us on the conversation, we have the host of News Central's The Conversation, Yona Oyegunmasade. She'll be, of course, lending some of her expertise and thoughts into this conversation as well. Yona? Wait, this is the first time I'm doing this with you, right? All right, so let's get this done. Ladies, this is the second part of our conversation about contraceptive use on the continent. Last week, we had some really interesting sound bites that came out of the conversation. And there's one thing that I want to get Yona's perspective on. Lolo, when you were here last week and we asked a question about getting men involved in contraceptive use, Lolo said, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting her directly. She said her aim is not to get the men involved. Her aim is to let young women and girls, or young girls and women, take the decisions for themselves, because the repercussions of early pregnancy, of certain things around family planning, are felt more deeply with them. Others are still looking at having more men come in, accepting contraceptive use, accepting family planning, even accepting just having their wives or their girlfriends make those decisions for themselves. What do you think about this, Yona?
I absolutely think that men have to be involved in the whole discussion around contraceptive use and family planning. In fact, it's so interesting because just yesterday, one of these tweets that have gone viral, I got it yesterday on WhatsApp, and it was a man talking about how if men don't change their behavior, it's actually not going to help with the whole idea of, family planning. And because men's sexual behavior, because they think they bear no consequence, one man, so the tweet was describing how one man can sleep with so many women, whereas the actions of one woman, the ramifications are much further reaching if men are not involved. So I think that it absolutely has to involve men. I think that it has to be a mindset thing, that men have to come to the realization that they bear some responsibility, in this whole picture, and that they really need to stand up to that responsibility.
And it's interesting you bring that up. I remember this week, another story that trended was of a man who has, I think, he's had 24 wives or thereabouts. His youngest wife is about 24. The youngest child is just about 13 months. And he says he believes he has 100 children. And he's going to continue to marry wives and have children as long as God continues to give him the ability to do so.
One man.
And then this brings into the issue, we talked about it last week, but I'll get Yona's perspective on this, on the cultural, traditional, religious aspects of these conversations. Many Africans, as we looked at last week, they had children because having more children meant more hands on the farm, more hands doing things, when that was how we lived our lives. Our lives have changed, but some of our thinking around the value, I'll put that in quotation, the value of the number of children you have has not changed. Then you have the religious connotations that come in from different people who say using contraception is bad, that God will make you fruitful and you will multiply and you should not hinder God's work in any way. When we look at the statistics for Africa, when we look at early childhood malnutrition, and you look at maternal mortality, and you look at early childhood deaths, those things do not bear out what our thinking is. How do we address that?
Are you addressing this to
let
me?
me start with you.
As far as being fruitful and multiply, I think we've fulfilled that mandate.
We've been quite fruitful.
I think God will accept that we've done our duty where that's concerned. I really think that as good stewards, even if you want to come from a religious point of view, I'm a Christian, and I do believe that we have to be good stewards of everything that we've been blessed with. That also means being responsible with how and when we bring children into this world. So I think for me that the religious argument is not really one that holds water. No, it's so critical, actually. It's so critical that that's what I was saying earlier about that mindset change. If we don't come into a place where we say, what are the realities of today? And what does it mean to be a responsible steward living in this world today? And it has ramifications on everything. It's how do we use and respect the environment?
Yes.
It's how do we use and respect the fact that we're living in a in a more populated society. So how do we respect the person next to us? Long ago, the person next to you may have been a kilometer away. Right now, the person next to you is inches away. Exactly. Thank you. So it's all of those things. And so we have to think, what is the reality for today? And what does it mean to be responsible citizens living in the world we live in today?
Very true. So let's get into the conversation as we segue into a conversation about sex education. But before that, we didn't really get into the myths around contraception last week. So let's quickly take a look at that. Some of the myths include, if your partner withdraws before ejaculation, you won't get pregnant. You can't get pregnant if you have sex during your period. You can't get pregnant if it's the first time you're having sex. Emergency contraception is only effective the morning after unprotected sex. Long-term use of contraception can make it harder for you to get pregnant later. You can't get pregnant if you're breastfeeding. I have a few friends who can tell you that's not true. So, Lola, you deal directly with young women, with young girls who may have basically told you they believe some of these things. How do we address these myths? Because somehow they're very far-reaching and they're very deep-rooted, and people will say it like it's a matter of fact and science.
Well, it goes back to sex education, creating awareness about contraceptives and giving accurate and scientific information about them. And just like we live in a society where negative news spreads faster than positive news. So, of course, all these myths around contraceptives that have negative innovations with them, it's going to go around. It's going to, like you said, it's far-reaching. So we need to counter that with another narrative, using like conversations that we're having here today, putting it in your movies, showing mothers going into family planning clinics, and getting them and planning their lives, and also showing young women, because it's very important to not just put this conversation around families, because now if I'm a young woman, I don't have a boyfriend, or I'm promiscuous in quotes,
whatever,
I might think this conversation does not relate to me. Exactly.
True,
because we think it's a family thing. It's not a family thing. That's why the conversation on should we get men involved, you first of all have to let women know that you don't have to do this just because it's a guy you're with. You have to know that it is your own power first as a woman. So by the time you are married with a man, you understand the power that this has over your own life. So we need to go back to sex education, start from schools. I had this conversation with a young girl recently, and she said that her teacher taught them that there are different types of family planning methods, but they did not want to give them specifics, so they don't start looking for it. So those kind of teach it. It's very popular. Yeah. People think if you tell young people
that you're the one who's actually taking them into
and you're encouraging them, and by the time they know about it, maybe they now want to try it. That is a myth, because when people don't know about something, that's when they do dangerous.
Yes, exactly.
So by
their
the time
behavior
they
is actually
know the accurate and scientific information concerning contraceptives, then it's easier to get them to get on board.
Okay, so let's get into that sex education situation. Now, in Ghana at a time, they were actually debating a proposed sex education program, but then it still remained a debate. And this was because religious groups came up and said it was part of a satanic attempt to promote the wrong values, as the program also did involve some conversation around LGBT conversations. Now, sometimes we take some of these attitudes we have and refuse to even have these conversations with our children. I remember a conversation I had on radio a few years back, and I talked about some of the abbreviations that young people use. Parents is watching something, and I fielded so many calls that day, and I always remember one or two calls who said that I'm the one who's teaching their children, that because I'm discussing it on radio, that I'm the one who's exposing their children. I had to tell them, if you think that I'm the one who's exposing your children, then you are. I'm so sorry for you.
Yeah, you've got your head buried in the sand.
Gentleman called me that his son was going to university that year, and the son was a virgin. The son told him he was a virgin, and he didn't know how to have the conversation. I said, even if your son is actually a virgin, the conversation window, it hasn't closed, but you have missed it. So let's deal with the fact that on the continent, if you want to bring comprehensive sex education into the conversation, you're first of all drowned out by many religious individuals or religious groups who say that is not part of our culture. It's not part of religious conversations they want to have. How do we address this? Yona, let me start with you.
Look, I think that we still live in a relatively socially conservative society, at least on the surface.
Hypocritically.
Hypocritically. People pretend to be, whether or not they're doing that in their personal lives is a different situation. But what I think is that there's a way that everyone can come to the table and meet each other halfway. So if on the surface of things we still want to appear to be quite a conservative society. There is a way you can have sex education. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If the powers that be, if lawmakers, if legislators, if leaders in society won't let us go the full Monty with sex education, then let's find out what content is actually permissible. Because some of it is better than none of it at all. You can tell kids, I think this is very innocuous. You can either abstain, you can be faithful to one partner, or you should make sure you use protection. This old ABC, story. I don't really think that that's necessarily too offensive. I don't know who it will offend, but I think that if you're talking about life-saving information, that's the very basic. When you then want to start building that up, but I think we have to have a conversation about, okay, what are the fundamentals and what are the things that we can, at least we can say some of these things. Okay. If some of the other issues like the LGBT issues and all of that are a little bit too sensitive right now, can we at least just
take them out and sort of step back from it? Okay, let's pause. We're going to get into this because there are some who are only proponents of abstinence-only sex education programs. The research says it doesn't work. It's realistic. But let's take a quick break on NC DeBrief. When we come back, we'll pick up the conversation from that point. And of course, Lolo will also give us her thoughts in this whole area of a comprehensive sex education program and what we need to do on the continent to have these conversations. Stay with us. Off-air conversations tend to be some of the best, but we hope to bring some of that good content on air for you. This is NC DeBrief, and it is, of course, part 2 of our conversation about contraceptive use on the continent. And we have gotten to a point where we're now talking about comprehensive sex education programs on the continent. We talked about what's happening or what was happening in Ghana, and Yona has shared her points. And then I'm bringing in this idea that some have that abstinence-only programs are the way to go with sex education. And before we went from a break, I heard Yona and I heard you say no. Research bears out abstinence-only sex education programs do not work. What do we do?
First, we need to acknowledge that it doesn't work. People do not want to accept the fact that it doesn't work because they believe that their own idea of how sex should be taught about is the only way that we
I think that might be step 2. Maybe we need to acknowledge that our kids are even having sex. Let's be honest. The age that children are having sex has gotten younger, at a point has now stabilized, but some children's first sexual experience is happening a lot younger than many people want to believe.
Yes, and it's also important to acknowledge that when we talk about comprehensive sexuality education, we're not just talking about sexual intercourse. There's a whole range of it. We have so many things from relationships,
which
sexual
also
health,
present risk, actually, not just
even
assault
and absolutely. So before you even teach a child, because we start comprehensive sex education way from the age 3-4, they have appropriate sex education. Before you teach a child about sex, you need to teach them about their body parts. So if you can't talk about sex, I know that in our country here, you're not even allowed to use the words like penis and vagina on radio, and because if you make words that are body parts, pornographic images, pornographic words, what message are you sending? So before we even talk about sex, we need to start from the basics, start from relationships, start from, human development, puberty. Some people don't know about puberty. The girls that start their period in JSS1, JSS to only learn about menstruation right after
when it happens.
So they're so confused. So sexuality education is not just about sex. Sex is a component, yes, but it stretches down to so many aspect of it. And when we want to talk about abstinence-based, again, like you said, it doesn't work. What works is comprehensive sexuality education because it talks about not just abstinence, which is one approach, but talks about teenage pregnancy, how to prevent pregnancy, different types of contraceptives.
Knowing when you're ready to
you're ready to have sex, even the first time you have sex, what are the emotions that are associated with it? So it's a very in-depth conversation, and people think it's an assumption again, narrative pushed by said religion, because religious people do not want to have a conversation around sex because to them
it's not it's
just to them sex should just be about procreation and not about pleasure. So when you bring up a conversation about sex, with children, with teenagers, they ask you, what exactly are you talking about with them? Are you telling them to go and get pregnant? Because to them, you can't even talk to them about sexual pleasure. So that is another layer of it. So when
can I just add something here? Because I actually do think, for me, it has almost sort of now become a dichotomy. The religious point of view and the non-religious point of view. But I think that the two sides can come together and really create very, very strong, compelling, effective sexual education programs. Now, on the religious side, what do they bring to the table? They bring ideas of your worth, your intrinsic worth as a person. Your intrinsic worth, your self-esteem, self-confidence, your intrinsic worth because of, their faith-based reasons for that intrinsic worth. But that's something that can be brought into sex education. I don't think that people can make positive, constructive choices about their sex and sexuality
if they don't value
themselves. And that's something that religion can bring. So if we see ourselves as, you know, opposite sides of the debate and there's never any meeting point and never any place where we can engage, where we can collaborate and cooperate, then we're going to have to keep on having this polarized, you know, discussion.
It's interesting that you brought that up, because in comprehensive sexual education, personal skills, where self-esteem, values, and all of that are brought up. So it is not excluded from the curriculum. The idea again is that people don't know what, you know, CSE is. So they don't even know that we talk about self-esteem. Like I said,
what I'm saying is that that's an opportunity to collaborate with even religious organizations.
But you need to also understand that when they talk about self-esteem, when they talk about, you know, the value that you place on yourself, they're still bringing it from a faith base. If you're going to teach about it in church, that's fine. But when you bring it into a school environment, it is inappropriate for you to try and impose your own religious or faith on the students there. We want to talk about, you know, scientific and accurate information. When we also talk about self-esteem and values, we want to take it from a place where it's non-judgmental. It has nothing to do with faith, but just about how the person feels about themselves. And that's what self-esteem is all about. So when we talk about self-esteem, we talk about it from a healthy and positive side. From the side of, if you choose to have sex, you need to know why you're doing it. Even the person that you're with, have you had that kind of conversation with them? Now, from the religious angle, I don't have anything with people of faith talking about, you know, sexual education, talking about abstinence and waiting till when you get married. That's your faith. But when you believe that that is the only way to go, and if we're not talking about it from that aspect, then we are wrong.
And then it ends up blocking a further conversation.
And when you even talk about abstinence and not give people accurate information, because I can say, I'm keeping myself from marriage, but I can still know all the facts.
Absolutely, and that's what I'm saying. Like, information does empower. I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I'm also saying that as opposed to being in a place where there's a divide, where never the two shall meet, you know, where we can't see that there's any value that one can get from the other, why don't we try and have a kind of more collaborative kind of conversation to say what value can either side bring to the table? It's not mutually exclusive. It's never going to be 100%. You know, they're never going to overlap 100%. But there is value that either side, and we can learn from each other and bring to the table, so that we can start saying, how can we do this together, as opposed to constantly.
This is what the conversation is about. You see, I let them go. And I like the time, because we need to have those conversations. Yeah. No one party needs to feel that they're excluded. So let me reference a study that happened in Ilorin. Now, this looked at the effect of sex education program on at-risk sexual behavior in school-going adolescents in Ilorin in Kwara State in Nigeria. Now, the study set out to determine whether a sex education intervention program would reduce at-risk sexual behaviors of school-going adolescents. It was carried out on just 24 school-going children aged between 13 and 19. Now, the findings showed that the specially designed intervention sex education program reduced at-risk sexual behavior in the adolescents, and the recommendation was that sex education should be introduced into the curriculum of secondary school education in Nigeria. That has not happened. We know it hasn't. Which now leads me to our next point of this conversation. Who should be teaching what and when? For many parents, and referencing that radio conversation again, there are many parents who called and said they don't want the teachers talking about it, that they will take care of it. But many parents also called and told me their parents didn't talk to them about it, so why should they talk about it? And then we now have these things that happen where parents don't have any of these conversations with their children until maybe even never. So who should talk about it? Should parents allow teachers to have these conversations about contraceptives? Apparently in the United States, there's a teacher who does an after-school program that she organizes and gives teens more detailed sex education information than they give in school. That program involves pornography, talking about pornography, contraceptives, and so much more. So if we're saying that we do not yet have a comprehensive sexual education program, then where is the onus? Who then does the talking about, as we like to say, the birds and the bees? Yona, let me start with you.
Look, at the end of the day,
because parents are failing.
Yes, if the health burden for all the consequences for not having the right information falls to the government at the end of the day, right? Then I think the government needs to take responsibility. Yes, absolutely. I think so. I think that there needs to be, and that's why I'm saying if we have a round table where people agree, what information fundamentally do we need to give our children to make sure that we avoid the worst kind of sexual behaviors, the most destructive kind of sexual behaviors. Let's agree on that and put that in the curriculum that has to be taught, whether it's a public or a private school. I think that's at the very basic level. So for me, that's the starting point. And it needs to be legislated. It needs to be a law that every school has to abide by. I think that we're teaching our children maths and English, and that's all well and good, and that's wonderful, and STEM and everything. But this is also a skill they need to have to be healthy, functioning adults, and so it should not be excluded, from school curriculum.
Lolo.
No, like you said, I just like what you said. It should not be excluded. In South Africa, I don't know if you're from South Africa.
No, I'm not.
She looks like she's from South Africa. In South Africa,
but I'll take it. It's fine.
In South Africa, sex education is not called sex education just because of the attitudes of the parents. They call it life skills or life orientation.
There we go.
Because again, sexuality education
so
is not just about sex. Yes. So tweaking the name to make it more acceptable for parents to embrace it is one way to go. But who's the honest? I would like for parents to start the conversation at home, because I spoke about how it's not something that starts when you're
early.
Yes, you don't start when you're 14. You start when you're 3 or 4, and the conversation start like, okay, this is your body part. No one should touch you here.
The proper names, not cute.
Proper names, yes, your PP. That is not it. Research has also shown that children who know the accurate names of their body parts are less likely to abuse, because when someone abuses them and they go and report, they know what they're saying. When you touch a child and say, "Don't touch my penis," the person is afraid.
Shocked. Yes.
People don't know. The perpetrators are looking for vulnerable kids that do not know anything. So when you do not teach your child, you make them susceptible to that. So that is one area as well. So even the thing of teaching it in school, it's very important. But also research has shown that even in countries where they've introduced it in school, the beliefs and the attitudes of teachers, not from the teachers who are meant to teach,
are also barriers.
It's also a barrier. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board, like you said, and say, how do we go about this? Should we go to schools, like you spoke about, extracurricular activities? Is this something that should happen once a week from an external teacher who comes to the school to talk about that? Or, should we train the teachers as well? Peer training is very important,
that's
because,
true.
like you said, the teachers are not just aliens that come to school. They are part of the bigger society.
And when you mention peer training, just look at a situation where you may have had SS1 or SS2 students who have gone through some of these things, and then they can teach their peers.
Absolutely.
In conversations about sex, parents, you like to deny it. We might be the first role models. We will never be the only role models for our children. And if you're saying that your child doesn't know this thing, your child is not with you 24 hours a day. Your ward is not with you.
They're getting some kind of information from somewhere.
Exactly, and it happens to be a lot of the times their peer group, and that group is responsible for sharing
to learn
fake
about sex through pornography.
Because that's the images that no one is talking about
the
now.
images that pornography is going to give your child is about, they're very demeaning and dehumanizing and often even abusive. But it's glamorized, and it's like, oh well, if this is how to do it, then this is how we go about it.
And funny enough,
so things like consent and things like that,
New studies are showing that the generation, well, most likely our generation of children younger, or the generation after us, that have been exposed to pornography, have issues with forming connections with other people, with respecting boundaries and consent, because pornography has given them a wrong impression of what relationships and sexual encounters between adults or between individuals should be.
But even when you talk about pornography, I think we like to think it's until you go to www.pornography.
No, it's not.
It's not just that. When you watch your movie, when you watch your normal movies, whether it's Hollywood or Nollywood, there's so many pornographic images there that people,
and even conversations,
absolutely, and we think that they don't have power, but they do have power. Like now, if two young people are having sex, there's no conversation around condoms. I'm talking about Nollywood. There's no conversation around condoms. It just goes straight to teenage pregnancy, unwanted abortions, and death.
No, they go to
exactly. Exactly. So these are other ways that children learn about sex, not just about pornographic images as well. And when we talk about porn, I like to tell young people that porn is just like watching Fast and Furious. When you're a young guy, you're younger, and you watch Fast and Furious, you love the way they drive. It's an adrenaline rush. You don't go at the back of the car driving behind. It doesn't work. So porn is just like that. It's just like it's a stimulant. It's just meant to excite you, to give you ideas. To want to try something. It's not a blueprint for how sex is meant to be like.
But many young people don't know that.
Exactly.
Because that's their first encounter with sex and sexual behavior.
But that's because there is no other place for them to get this information. So if you don't give them that information,
you're not getting it in school. You're not getting it at home. You're not getting it with your religious bodies. If you're getting it with your peer group, you're likely getting wrong information. Like if they touch you now, you're going to be pregnant. Ladies, it's been an absolutely fantastic conversation, and one that we hope that if you're out there listening and you're watching, you've picked up something. One of the biggest things is start these conversations with children earlier. And I really take away from what Lolo said in terms of when you hear comprehensive sexuality education, it does not mean that it is everything about sex. It is about knowing your body parts, understanding how your body works, understanding consent, relationship, boundaries, so many things. And these are things that I love what South Africa is doing. They are life skills. There are ways that people become well-rounded, fully functioning adults. I want to say there'll be a part 3 because I can hear some conversations, but this is what we do on NC DeBrief. We have these conversations and we speak to Africa and we speak to Africans and we speak to ourselves about what it is that we really do need to talk about. So ladies, I'm going to give you an opportunity, 30 seconds to quickly wrap things up. This started from part 1 about contraceptive use on the continent, but we couldn't have had that conversation without looking at how we talk about sex and sex education. So Yona, where do we wrap all of this up? What do we do? A parent out there, an educator, what is it?
I think that the different sides of this debate, you know, sex education, no sex education, need to come around and sit and reach an agreement to create a comprehensive program that works for the most part.
Yeah.
It might not be 100% of what everyone wants, but I think we agree that this is a life and death issue, actually. And we need to do better for our young people. So let's come together and agree on sex education that we can actually deliver to our young people because it's life-saving.
Okay, Lolo?
Well, I always like to go back to the media because you guys do. I want us to talk to Nollywood. I want us to talk to newscasters.
Kannywood and talk to Gollywood.
Exactly. Please talk to them
whoever.
to incorporate these concepts into their stories, to make them life skills, like I said, to make it normalized. Because the more normalized it is, the easier it is for young people to get in on these conversations. And not just the young people, their parents as well. It begins to recondition their mind concerning this issue. So that's just my 2 points.
All right, thank you so much, lady. A very big thank you to Lolo as well as Jonah for stepping in and joining this conversation. Now, that's it on today's NC DeBrief. You can keep the conversation and the contributions going. Use the hashtag NC DeBrief. You can also, of course, go to our YouTube channel, New Central TV, if you missed part 1, and that was a fantastic conversation as well. Check out Pan-African fantastic content on our website, www.newcentral.africa. Until next week, we have a live edition of NC DeBrief coming your way every Friday at 1 p.m. West African time. I'm Tolu Lokpe Adeleru Balogun. Until next time, stay safe and remember, it's all about Africa first.